Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Welcome to the Friday edition of Balance of Power. Welcome to November, the 1st of November. I forgot to say rabbit this morning. I just realized it. As we join you live from World Headquarters in New York on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite radio, and on YouTube, search Bloomberg Business News Live if you want to come on in. We've got the camera set up as always. It's great to be back here as we settle in for the long haul. We're not here by accident. We are moving into World Headquarters for the duration of this election. We're not going back home till they call it. Kailey's on her way. She'll be joining us with special coverage, full smash, Tuesday night right here on Bloomberg Radio, as you would expect. That goes for YouTube as well, by the way. You want the best free coverage in the world? Keep both of these options in mind. It's all about Wisconsin today. Kamala Harris leaving Las Vegas to Wisconsin. She's in several locations there. How about the Isley Brothers? That's pretty cool, by the way. Playing together. Big concert tonight with many more contemporary artists. But as Gwen Moore reminded us yesterday, the Isley Brothers are still together. Donald Trump in Warren, Michigan, back to Milwaukee again. Yeah, it's all Wisconsin, it's all Michigan, and we have new numbers out in the swing states. Marist right now finds a 2-point race in Pennsylvania. Harris up by 2, Harris up by 3 in Michigan, Harris up by 2 in Wisconsin. But I can find polls that say that they're tied or that Donald Trump is in charge. And Politico put this together pretty well for us. Before we bring in Joe Weisenthal, just imagine, you want to know how chaotic all of this is. 538's forecast, Trump 53 times out of 100. New York Times polling average, Harris by 1 point. Nate Silver's model, Trump 55% of the time. S&P 500, Harris. Polymarket, Trump. Voter enthusiasm, Harris by a whisker, according to Gallup. Right track, wrong track, Trump. Net favorability rating, Harris. No one has a clue. Although Wall Street, again, seems to think that this is Trump's race to lose, and that's where we get into it. With half of Odd Lots, the stalwart, Joe Weisenthal. It's the first phone call we make whenever we leave Washington and come to New York. It's great to see you. Thank you for stopping down to see me. Great to see you.
Thank you. Likewise.
I just want to get in your head for a little bit here because Wall Street thinks it has this figured out, and I want to know why.
It's interesting. About a week ago, I don't think it was just Wall Street. About a week ago, everyone I was talking to, they're like, I think Trump's going to win.
You woke up one Monday morning.
Yeah, it was like about a week or so ago, and I realized that everyone around me just sort of thought Trump was going to win. And I have no opinion. I'm just a journalist. I'm not. But then, it's like, oh, this is really like locked in as conventional wisdom. But the thing was, like, there's no poll, there's no prediction market, there's no model like the Nate Silver model that has ever said Trump is a lock to win. Even at 60% or say even 65% in the prediction markets, which was around as high, is not a lock. I mean, 1 in 3 odds come in all the time. Well, I guess they come in about 1 in 3. Like, that's not a lock at all. And so it's been interesting, to see this tightening in some of a little bit of movement in the prediction markets. And then some of these Trump trades, some of these stocks like start to waver a little bit. In the last week, it feels like to some extent, people have woken up to the fact, no, this looks like a very close race based on almost any metric you can see.
So with all of that said, what are we setting ourselves up for if this is going to take days? We wake up Wednesday, nobody knows. Is this market primed for volatility?
I think there's two things. I mean, uncertainty, people would probably just like to know. Yeah. And then I think that there's the question of, like, how much will it be contested through the legal system, and that creates its own uncertainty because it pushes back the date. Yeah. But I think then there's this other element that it's not very good for the country to have so much distrust about the results, right? So even like let's say it were to take 2 weeks or something like that, because there's a lot of close races and some ambiguity in some states. But then we get some sort of resolution. Okay, that's uncertainty. But then there's like, what does it mean that every election now is presumed to be fought over courts and technicalities rather than the votes? And then I think this is where the sort of like deeper anxiety comes in about, like, you think about treasuries, you think about the US dollar, you think about what makes American companies great. It's not great for American companies or enterprise in economics if there's huge chunks of the population that it feels like will simply not trust the results, whichever way it goes.
Is that why the VIX is creeping up on 22 here today, or is that has to do with earnings? I think
there's a lot. I mean, look, I think there's a lot going on. I think, once again, today's jobs report, we sort of, collectively, I think, blacked out the economy over the last month. They're like, we're just not going to talk that much about the economy. Yeah. You haven't heard much. There's a Fed meeting next week, too. No one's really talking about that. I mean, I guess at 25 basis points a lot, but now there's a fair amount of economic ambiguity after today's jobs report, and once again a lot of uncertainty. And then you see some of this other stuff with rates rising in the UK and rates rising in Australia hitting their highest levels since last November. What's going on there? So the other thing that's going to happen is we're going to have to refocus and figure out what's happening in the U.S. economic conditions, which are ambiguous.
So let's talk about that jobs report, because I saw you tweeting about it earlier, and clearly this is not just noisy. This is an aberration. We had hurricanes, we had strikes.
That's right.
And people are wondering how to interpret this. Donald Trump, by the way, is blaming the Harris policy, or even
as one does in an election.
Yes, exactly. But the fact of the matter is, the response rate, as you point out, to the establishment survey was just over 47%, way below last month's 62%, lowest since January 91.
Omer Sharif, who I have to give a big shout out to, he has a little shop called Inflation Insights, and he knows the data better than anyone else. And I saw this in one of his email blasts that he sent out right after the report. Again, so there's so many levels of noise here because you had the hurricane. Everyone knew the hurricane was going to have an effect, which is why there was already a big step down sequentially in the expectations. That's why economists had 100K. So everyone knew that. Everyone knew the Boeing strike had happened. I hadn't seen as much talk about that specifically as a factor, but that was obviously something that people could have anticipated. I would say two things. A, the number was still weak. B, the revisions were negative, and this is really important because we've had negative revisions to prior jobs report throughout the year.
Yes.
Then last month we got upward revisions. And that sort of, I think, was taken as a signal, maybe this wasn't a blip, is actually sustained. To see those get revised down again, I think creates a lot of maybe more confidence that there is a weakening.
Sure.
We also got the JOLTS report this week that showed an ongoing decline in the quits rate, an ongoing decline in the number of job openings. That reminds people that the job market is weak. But to this point about the non-response rate, sort of just another reason to scratch our heads and say, we don't really know what's going on right now.
But then you poke the bear and say one issue with chalking it all up to the hurricane and strikes is that every economist who put out a number on the Bloomberg survey knew there were hurricanes and strikes.
By the way, we have to give a big shout out to our colleague Anna Wong, who had she had a negative 10K, which was far and away the closest of any.
She would have won on The Price is Right.
She would have definitely won on The Price is Right. So this is really impressive because some people had well over 100K. So there are some people that were taking this, but again, the fact that we knew about the hurricane, the fact that the Boeing strike has been in the news, it's a reason to simply think you can't just dismiss this number because these all get baked in when the professional forecasters put in that forecast.
Right. It's a funny business.
Yeah.
Where do you think about this whole poly market story, or does it bore you?
No, I mean, I think it's really interesting because I think a couple of things. One is that it seems like now, there's a lot, it seems like now that prediction markets are here to stay, and there'll always be a coverage. There'll always be an aspect in how we analyze big events. Two, I don't think it's crazy to think that these numbers aren't as good in the sense as other markets that are out there, like the U.S. Treasury market. They really are thin markets. Something a friend of mine pointed out to me yesterday is if you want to sell 2 million contracts on Trump. Let's say you're long Trump and you want to get out of your position.
Yeah.
The poly market headline prices is around 61 or 62. To sell 2 million drops the price to below 57. The order book is really thin on these markets. Another thing to note is that if you look at the regulated U.S. prediction market, Kalshi, which only got the green light to do this a couple weeks ago, their prices are meaningfully different than the poly market prices. It remains a bit of a mystery why traders can't arbitrage the gap between the two. So I would say, these markets are here to stay. They're going to be part of how we consume information going into elections for the time being, for a long time. But the degree to which they're really clear signals, maybe just because they're young, because there isn't a lot of money behind them, because there are regulatory constraints and all kinds of. I mean, it's not legal for U.S. citizens to do polymarket. We all know they do it because they use VPNs to disguise where their computer is coming from.
Yes.
But it's not legal. And so, like, when these markets have sufficient depth so that we can say, okay, there is real money here. Yeah. We can really find a correlation between, say, what treasuries are doing, what Bitcoin is doing, what Polymarket is saying. Like, we're not there yet.
Let me ask you this. I have like a minute left. I don't want to blow your mind. But look at the rules on some of these contracts.
Yeah. Yes.
Polymarket. Resolution source for this market is the Associated Press, Fox, NBC, calling the race. Robinhood will pay out January 8th after the results are certified by the Congress on January 6th. Is part of this being driven by conspiracy, thinking the House will solve the election?
I'll say this. People who are into betting and take these markets really seriously, one of the things they're talking about is the possibility that Kamala Harris wins, but like, let's say Wednesday, it's clear. I don't know if it will be, but let's just say Wednesday we're clear. But there is a belief that there is a contingent of Trump traders who wouldn't bid it, who will buy his odds even at 2 or 3%.
Yeah.
Because they're convinced that some sort of Deus Ex Machina will happen in the House.
Right.
So it may not even go to 100% even after everyone's called it.
Think of all the inputs.
Yeah,
It's
so many
absolute
inputs
madness.
and rules.
Do you watch the election results like it's a game Tuesday night, or you just wake up the next day and tell me what happened?
Of course I'm going to be online,
All right.
and I'll be watching.
Got to be
every
the
time.
first Grateful Dead shirt in the history of Balance of Power. Paging Wiley Nickel, Joe Weisenthal on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We made it to New York. We're live at World Headquarters in Manhattan. Here at the mothership for the duration, the big show, Tuesday night special coverage. And of course, we're all, we're looking at this as election day or election week, really, because nobody thinks this is finished by Wednesday or Thursday, depending on who you ask. I've had a couple of people come in here lately. I don't know if they're just projecting aspirations that we might get an earlier call than we did 4 years ago. But of course, so much of the conversation in the closing moments here, we're 4 days out, can you believe it? Has just devolved around garbage. Literally, we're talking about garbage. And Donald Trump, as we'll get into a little bit later, gets a fourth day out of this with a stenographer highlighting the changing of the way they recorded this call with Joe Biden. We'll do another garbage stop at some point here. But the comments about Liz Cheney are resonating today as well. You just can't even keep up with the news flow at this stage. It'll be like this all weekend, early next week into Election Day, as Donald Trump spent some time with Tucker Carlson. It was a Halloween special. And actually quite scary, I suspect, if you are Liz Cheney watching this, some saw it as a threat to her life. Listen to what Donald Trump said last night.
She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. When the guns are trained on her face. They're all war hawks when they're sitting in Washington in a nice building saying, oh, gee, let's send 10,000 troops right into the mouth of the enemy.
There you have it. There's a smattering of applause there. Let's see how she feels about it when the guns are trained on her face, he said. Timothy O'Brien is executive director of Bloomberg Opinion, senior executive director, and he's the man who wrote the book on Trump, and we wanted to spend some time with him since we're back here in New York. Tim, it's great to see you.
Good to see you,
thanks
Joe.
for spending some time with us
Thank you
here.
for having me.
Surely you were watching this. You can't hide from it. This was at the Desert Diamond Arena in Glendale, Arizona. How is that for a closing argument? Some folks are, in fact, suggesting that this might have put Liz Cheney in danger, that it was a threat on her life. Of course, the Trump campaign is not going to see it like that, and we've already heard from them. But how did you interpret that remark?
Well, I think the Trump campaign's not going to see it like that because they want to, as every campaign does, cast their candidate in the best light. The reality of it is he made a statement about Liz Cheney being soft on war, and that she needed to know what the experience of war was like in order to be more sensitive to it. However, the way he said it invoked violence against her, pure and simple. There's been a debate about the specifics of what that violence might have been based on what he said, but the reality is he's a former president of the United States. He is on a stage, and he is talking about violence against one of his most high-profile critics, a member of the Republican Party, and he's putting her in harm's way, pure and simple. And he's done this for years. He's done it at his rallies, not just about Liz Cheney, but about people he regards as his critics or his opponents. And it's not an accident. He revels in violence. He's called for it in the past. So it's irresponsible and it's uncivilized. And I don't think that that's an ideological or a partisan viewpoint. It's just about, I think, civility and a call to be better in the way that we speak about our differences and not have it devolve into violence. But that's not who he is.
Liz Cheney responded, you might have seen, quote, "This is how dictators destroy free nations. They threaten those who speak against them with death," unquote. She retweeted the video of him delivering those words, sitting down with Tucker Carlson. So bring me, I know you can't.
Can I add just one other quick thought, Joe?
Yes.
Recently, his chief of staff, John Kelly, said he believed that Trump had fascist tendencies. Another General Milley, has criticized Trump. Milley, a senior member of the military, said he felt physically threatened in the wake of speaking out publicly about Trump. And he went home and he put in, bulletproof windows in his home. So these aren't just light, fantastical fears that these people have once they get in the radar.
Well, can you imagine the threats that Liz Cheney is dealing with that we never hear about? But I guess my question for you is, what's Donald Trump's motivation here? This is how it goes in the final throes now. This is the third cycle we've seen. And in that last week, wild things are said. To your point, not all of them are new, but you get this concentrated version. And he's clearly flooding the zone. And we're talking about him all day, every day. Is that the point here, or he just can't help but to say some of these things?
I mean, I just think it's who he is. I think one of the reasons his base finds him attractive and feels an allegiance to him is that he's authentic and that he does speak, I think, in a very visceral way about what he cares about. And what we found out at Madison Square Garden is he cares about race and misogyny and hostility. And what you found out last night is violence. And I think that he's just in the home stretch and he's speaking around the themes that he has used for a long time. I think they're obviously becoming part of our public debates because we're close to Election Day. But this is obviously not standard political fare. And I think that people thinking about this and what to do about it as voters should talk about the public dialogues they want to have around the economy and policy and foreign affairs and the things that we should care about as a community, as opposed to, I think, some of these cultural and personal issues that divide us.
In the closing hours of this campaign, a real Trump supporter who actually knows the policy proposals and is familiar with his first term, say the same thing. No new wars, good economy. I don't care about the rest. Those are my priorities, which is a pretty strong message in the closing hours of this campaign. How does Kamala Harris answer it?
Well, I think she's been trying to lay out policy issues. She's spoken about.
Has she effectively answered that?
I think she has.
How about this no new wars thing? That resonates with a lot of Trump supporters.
Well, I think that the United States has to decide what they mean what we mean when we say no new wars. I think people feel we have an obligation to Israel. People feel that we have some people feel we have an obligation to Ukraine. Some people feel we have an obligation to Taiwan.
And he would tell you none of those would have happened
if he was president,
office,
right? But in fact, there were multiple aggressions while he was president, and the issue here is what's our role in the world in terms of securing global security so we can have a strong economy and a safe world. Those are, I think, also nonpartisan issues that we should think long and hard about. So
give me Timothy O'Brien's election night. I want to know what you're watching, what you care about, how you take it in.
Well, like everybody else, Joe, I'm watching the swing states. They're as tight as ever.
Are you of the mind, like so many people, this call happens earlier than
I'm not.
4 years ago?
No, I'm not.
So you're in for the long haul.
Yeah, I mean, remember, like 4 years ago, we were waiting on Pennsylvania till Friday or Saturday, and I don't know if it'll be Pennsylvania this time. It could be Michigan. It might be Georgia or North Carolina. Those three seem to me like the iffier ones, and it's going to come down to I think probably what happens in half of the swing states in terms of who gets into the White House.
How concerned are you about reports of poll watchers intimidating people, the many lawsuits that we see continued to be filed in real time, challenging results in Pennsylvania again and in other states. What's this going to feel like by next Wednesday or Thursday?
Well, I think people are already drained by it now. I think this will just be another turn of the screw, but we have to go through this. I think voting is important, again, for nonpartisan and non-ideological reasons, and we should think of polling places as safe havens, not places where you're worried about getting beaten up.
Well, yeah.
And our elections are not fixed. In the troubled elections around the entire planet, the United States does a pretty good job of having clean and fair elections.
There's a lot of Stop Bastille tweeting going on out there already. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Donald Trump himself, talking about massive, widespread fraud. And I was talking about this yesterday. He talks about the weave. We call this the blur. Every day, 5 headlines like this, and people start to just kind of step back and say, yeah, this whole thing's broken. It's crazy out there.
I can't trust anything.
Right.
And it's not just about
the cumulative
voting.
effect.
It's about war or immigration or the economy. You name the issue. And I think it is designed to keep us from focusing on the facts and from having a healthy conversation about how to think about the facts.
Sure. So Wednesday, Thursday, more lawsuits are filed and so forth. Is this the 9-week slog that Bruce Mehlman was writing about, where we really actually don't have this settled until January 6th on certification day?
I think it depends on the margin of victory.
Okay.
And then I think it depends on how the alacrity with the judges who preside over these in courtrooms across the United States respond. They've already been pretty aggressive in this cycle about batting back the more ridiculous ones in a way they weren't in 2020. And the judges comported themselves well, I think, in 2020. But that's sort of a knife's edge to keep an election result balanced upon. Does
he declare victory at 10 o'clock at night on Tuesday, no matter what is
Donald
happening?
Trump never loses, Joe. His gravestone will say, "I won."
Sounds like a yes.
Yeah, I think he'll declare victory for the next 2
But we've been
decades.
through this a couple times already. So does it land differently in 2024?
That's a great question. I think, because at the end of the day, voters are the thing that will preserve and save us, not journalists, not lawyers, not the federal government, but voters. And I think voters are the ones who have to keep, their eyes on the prize in all of this.
Well, I suspect that is something that a lot of news organizations are prepared for, and I wonder what this is going to mean. Later this hour, or later in the program, I should say, we're going to talk to Julie Pace from the Associated Press, who's tasked with making the call. It's a different equation against the backdrop of all of this noise, isn't it? Do you think the Associated Press is compelled to maybe slow the roll a little bit more in 2024?
They've been around the block. I think they've always been an extremely valuable and judicious news organization for that reason, and I think they'll call it as they see it.
Well, there are a lot of inputs this time. When you're looking at a district and there's a potential for a recount or a multiple lawsuits, do you factor that in, or should this be truly a numbers game?
I think they have to call it based on the
races?
numbers they see.
Yeah.
And if those numbers are contested later, fine. But they have to call the numbers as the polling data shows.
It's the Associated Press would be the gold standard. We'll be watching a lot of other networks as well. But when you hear us talking about these races next Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and beyond, that will be the number that we're looking for. Do we get a call on the Senate earlier? We'll have a sense.
I think so. I think the Senate. I think the Republicans are in a very advantageous place with vis-a-vis the Senate, and very competitive in the House. And I don't think the kind of propaganda swirls around congressional races that swirl around the presidential race.
I'll get a bunch of tweets for this, but Philip Bump is writing, we just have a minute left, in the Washington Post about how Donald Trump talks about groceries, and he constantly goes back to the BLT, bacon, lettuce, tomato, in his stump speech.
Right.
Because he's maybe never gone grocery shopping before. Is that true?
Yes. I mean, maybe at the beach he went into a package store to get, a sandwich, but no.
You remember George Bush with the gallon of milk?
Yeah.
With the scanner?
Didn't know what a scanner was?
You could lose an election over that back then.
He definitely hasn't shopped for his own groceries. He's had, maids and cooks and staff for his entire existence.
Bacon, lettuce, tomato.
Yeah.
It's great to see you.
Good to see you, Joe.
I'm here all week. Let's do it again.
I'd love
Timothy
to.
O'Brien. Find him on the terminal, of course. OPIN Go, Bloomberg Opinion.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Today, as we work our way into the final weekend before this election cycle, promising special coverage, full smash here on Bloomberg TV and radio Tuesday night. That'll start at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to have a lot more to talk about with regard to this election and the final throes of this cycle, with some pretty wild rhetoric that we were hearing just last night on Halloween from Donald Trump. We're following the Harris campaign. They're both back in the swing states in the Midwest today. It's all about Wisconsin for some reason, and we do have some new numbers from the states as well. On what is, of course, also a jobs day, Amy Morris is looking at the markets for us through the guise of today's jobs report. All the data out now. This is all we're going to get between now and the election and the Fed meeting, of course. Payrolls increased by just 12,000. What is this, you say? Not what we expected, that's what. But if you look at the markets today, it certainly doesn't seem to be a problem, and everyone seems to know what went on here. The impact of the hurricanes, the impact of the strikes blew the number out here, and it's basically an aberration. Hiring advancing at the slowest pace since 2020, as I read from Molly Smith, who's going to join us after we talk to the chairman. He's with us from the North Lawn at the White House right now. Bernstein, chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Mr. Chairman, it's great to see you. Welcome, as always, to Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm wondering, what was in your head? What would this report have looked like if it were not for the storms?
Well, the storms and the strikes. I mean, one of the things we went into this report knowing, because the Bureau of Labor Statistics told us, was that the strike was going to subtract more than 40,000 workers, and we saw more than that in the manufacturing of transportation equipment. That was down about 44K. Now we know that there's upstream workers. I think some of the decline in temp workers, upstream workers in manufacturing from probably Boeing supply chains, I would probably assign another 10K negative on that. And then you get over to the hurricanes. That's much more uncertain, much harder to estimate. But the Bureau itself, which they don't often do, the Bureau itself said that the hurricanes very likely played a role here. So the way you set it up is exactly right. The underlying strength of the American economy, the American labor force is ongoing. We have a full spate of reports from this week that show that to be the case. And if you look at the unemployment rate, which is far less affected by strikes and hurricanes, that held at 4.1%, an historically low rate. So you have to block out the noise, try to find the signal, and if you do so, you see the U.S. economy continues to move ahead with momentum.
The response rate to the establishment survey, Jared, was just 47.4%. The lowest since January of 1991, well below last month's 62%. What do you make of that number?
There were 460,000 people, according to the Bureau this morning, that couldn't get to work because of the weather. Not every one of those persons got taken off payrolls. If they were paid over the relevant period, they'd be counted. But obviously, many of them were taken off payrolls, as were strikers. Strikers don't get counted on payrolls, but the strikers do get counted as being employed in the other survey, in the household survey. And that's why, if you want to think of it simply, take some signal. Look, you never want to over-torque on 1 month, and this month especially, you want to be mindful of the noise. But take some signal from the unemployment rate, which held steady at 4.1, and you got to write off the payroll number as largely noise due to strikes and hurricanes.
4.1, I believe, is the lowest pre-election unemployment rate in 24 years, Jared. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that. And I guess I would ask you, big picture then, for the sake of our viewers and listeners today, how would you describe the market if it weren't for these aberrations? How would you describe the job market days before this election?
Growing at a solid pace, generating enough jobs to hold the unemployment rate where it is, so hitting what economists call the break-even level, meaning enough employment to absorb people coming into the labor force, give people good job opportunities to upgrade. Even though vacancies have come down, we still have significant openings. And I think the main thing from the perspective of American working households is that this jobs report, including in October, is generating real wage gains. Wages were up 4% year over year. Now, we don't have the CPI yet for October, but for September it was 2.4%, and expectations are that it's somewhere in that ballpark, which means yet another growth, yet another month of real wage growth. Earlier this week in the consumer spending report, we learned that disposable income, real after-tax income, also up, and in fact, since this president took office, up $4,000. Real buying power up for working households. Now, Our work is not done, Joe. We've talked about this a lot. We have to continue our cost-cutting agenda in housing, in childcare, in healthcare, in prescription drugs, and we have to defend that agenda against those who would repeal it, pushing prices in exactly the wrong direction.
We heard from the Donald Trump campaign a response to the job market this morning. Jared, it does not make mention of hurricanes, but it says in a single month, Kamala's failed economic agenda wiped out nearly 30,000 private sector jobs, nearly 50,000 manufacturing jobs. Working families, it goes on to say, are being ripped off by the Harris-Biden economic agenda. Kamala broke the economy. You can respond to that as you will. But I wonder if the Harris-Biden economic agenda includes the weather.
I don't do electoral politics. I need to stay out of that. I will say the following. If you're commenting on or analyzing or putting forth an interpretation of today's payroll number that ignores hurricanes and ignores strikes, you are not engaged in good faith analysis. You are engaged in political manipulation, and you should be summarily ignored.
That said, no hurricanes, and potentially, as we're reading today, progress in the Boeing strike, Jared, would make next jobs report look like what?
Yeah, it's a great point. So we know we have an agreement between the machinists and the machinists, I should say the union leadership, and the management for a vote on Monday. It is, of course, up to the rank and file to decide whether they approve that new contract, but that is a good news of progress in that area. One of the things we showed today, you guys would love this, so you should go check it out on my Twitter feed, which is EconJared46, is if you look at the movement in unemployment claims, this is responsive to your question about what to expect next month. The unemployment claims really spiked, as they should, in the areas that were affected by hurricanes, devastated by hurricanes. As those areas rebuild and get back on track, and there's still a long way to go. They were devastated, and we're going to help them every step of the way. You see claims coming back down. That spike has really done a pretty significant round trip. And by the way, we contrast that to areas where there was no hurricane, and there you see claims were pretty flat. So if you look at claims response to the hurricane, they went up, they came down, and when they went up was the reference period for the payroll survey. It explains the noise in the payroll survey today. But yes, it looks like we should be getting back on track for next month's report.
Okay. I'm not allowed to ask you about the Fed because I know you're going to talk to me about Fed independence, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'd ask you, with the data we've seen here, it was a big data week leading into this election, and this Fed meeting just happens to be one next week. You probably didn't hear about it. But I wonder if the data change your view when it comes to the trajectory of interest rates, if only in the bond market.
Well, we've seen rates in the bond market be somewhat elevated. We've certainly seen the mortgage rate go up. And, part of that has to do with the stronger economy. So, look, under President Biden, we got the GDP report this week. Under President Biden, the annualized growth rate for GDP has been slightly north of 3%. That is a very strong, very much above trend growth rate. So strong growth, solid labor market, easing prices, real wage and income gains, certainly putting some upward pressure there. But I also think there's a policy element going on in that spread, in that interest rate. And I think it has to do with the idea that one of the candidates is talking about massive tariffs acting as a sales tax on the middle class, massive deportations, terrible idea for the labor market, and compromising Fed independence. That may also be putting some upward pressure on rates. And I think that's just a sign of some of those destructive ideas.
Wow. Analysis from the chairman. What a treat. Jared Bernstein, great to see you, sir, chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors from a sunny North Lawn.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
At World Headquarters in New York, thanks for joining us on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's the Friday edition. And the stenography office is calling. Producer James is calling this apostrophe gate, and I wonder if this starts to take on some momentum here. If you've not heard about this, we're getting a fourth day. Guess it's 5, actually. It's Friday. We've been doing this since Madison Square Garden. A 5th day of the garbage story, as the Associated Press reports that White House officials altered the official transcript of President Biden's garbage remark, despite some concern by the stenographers at the White House. They actually managed to obtain an internal email from, the White House stenography office, called the press office's intervention, quote, a breach of protocol and spoliation of transcript integrity between the stenography and press offices. This, of course, goes back to the whole garbage remark, right? President Biden was on this Voto Latino call when he responded to the joke at Madison Square Garden, not very funny one, that referred to Puerto Rico as an island of floating garbage. That, of course, was turned into a meme, a living meme by Donald Trump as he dressed up like a garbage man and got into a garbage truck. Got a 3rd day out of that. Now we're up now to a 5th day here because of the stenography office. And it really just has to do with not only showing exactly on the record what the president said, but the integrity of the messaging coming out of the White House in this administration. That's where we start with our panel this hour. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are with us, Bloomberg Politics contributors. He is partner at Stone Court Capital, Republican strategist. She is a political science professor at Iona University and Democratic analyst. Jeanne, what's your thought on this? When the stenography office gets upset, it's not too often they show up in the headlines here. Do we have a problem?
Yeah, I think it would be far bigger problem if Joe Biden was still at the top of the ticket. But this is serious. These are nonpartisan civil servants. They take their duty very seriously, as do I, because this goes to the National Archives. These are records for historians 50, 100 years from now to know what had happened and what was said. It's an example of the cover-up being worse than the crime, because Joe Biden made a mistake when he was speaking. The White House press office or whoever went and tried to strong-arm these stenographers should have left it that way. Instead, they tried to get involved and change, and I guess they did successfully change what had been said. And that is problematic. Do I think it's going to impact the election? No. But for all of us who care about a record of American history in our archives, this is unacceptable, and the White House should change it back to the way the professional, nonpartisan stenographers had it. Place.
I had a feeling as an academic that you might feel that way. Rick, the actual change here, literally, it's an apostrophe. Joe Biden said on the call, quote, the only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. His demonization of Latinos is unconscionable, and that's un-American, unquote. The transcript released by the press office, as I read in the pages of the Associated Press, rendered the quote with an apostrophe, reading supporters, possessive rather than supporters, plural. Is this just silly splitting of hairs, or is this a problem, Rick?
I think by now all the methane is out of this trash heap. Really, do we have to talk about the garbage comments anymore? 4 days into this thing, 5 days.
But this is about the White House. When the stenographer's office calls, I don't know.
But my guess is nobody's been fighting over commas and apostrophes other than on politically sensitive remarks like these. And look, Joe Biden made a mistake. He should have never weighed in on this thing. And they ought to just let the stenographers in the White House do their job. Nobody is going to think history has changed. If someone wants to look this up, they're going to see reams of reporting on this, that it's not about what he said, it's about how it was taken. I think all the damage that was done, if there was any damage, has already been done. This is not going to be an election weekend story. And I think apostrophe gate will go along with all the other gates that we've had, which is, more smoke than fire.
Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino on apostrophe gate as we bring you back to the Tucker Carlson live tour show in Glendale, Arizona. They occupied the Desert Diamond Arena for a big rally last night. Rick and Jeanne, Donald Trump sat down with Tucker Carlson and he said some things about Liz Cheney that are also driving headlines. Now, again, we haven't touched policy yet in this segment because no one's talking policy with the noise and the rhetoric coming out of well, I guess everywhere at this point. Listen to what Donald Trump said about Liz Cheney, and we'll get your reaction.
She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face. You know, they're all war hawks when they're sitting in Washington in a nice building saying, oh, gee, let's send 10,000 troops right into the mouth of the enemy.
Now, Jeanne, I don't know what he meant by that. People are interpreting this as a threat. Let's put her with a rifle, right? He's got her, put a rifle in her hand, standing there, 9 barrels shooting at her. I guess he's implying let's put her in a battlefield as someone who calls, as he says, for forever wars. He referred to her as a war hawk. Did he mean that, or was he implying something different?
You know, to listen to the campaign, not surprisingly, they say we are all taking it out of context, but you just played the piece and you can hear in there what he was saying. He is talking about putting guns in the face of somebody who politically opposes him and seeing how she likes it. The imagery alone is unconscionable. And this is vintage Donald Trump. And Liz Cheney, when you look at her tweet and her response, she says, and I think rightly so, he is not fit from a character perspective to be president. That is what the people have worked closely with him have said. And that she also then ties this into the fact that women should not forget that we don't have to stand for this. You know, there is no way around the fact that he is doing himself a disservice with this rhetoric, and that it is something that can potentially and should, in my mind, cost him the election. You don't talk about shooting your opponents. That is the thing of dictators. Is
this another media narrative, Rick? How did you hear it?
You know, look, I mean, you can parse this thing all you want. It was super inappropriate. You know, and regardless of how he meant it to be, you cannot say that you're going to shoot someone or have someone shot in the face. I mean, it's just the insensitivity that goes along with that remark is, you know, clear, right? I mean, like nobody who hears that's going to think anything other than that's inappropriate. There's no way to explain it around. And I would say this has been consistent with Donald Trump through the latter half of October. He's done everything he could to kind of put obstacles in his way. He didn't have to have this kind of a day. He could have been talking about other issues like garbage and things like that. But the reality is that he's his own worst enemy. I mean, honestly, I think that there have been very few attacks by Kamala Harris in the waning days of the campaign here that have done more damage than Donald Trump's own statements. Even the idea of talking about the election, you know, is already being flawed. I mean, it just reminds voters, especially in places like Pennsylvania, that had to go through a lot of lawsuits last time post-election, that this is the kind of chaos that he brings to the table. It doesn't really matter whether he means it. It doesn't really matter. It's chaos. And I do think that is a factor. I mean, like if voters who have yet to vote think that they're entering into another, you know, 4 years of chaotic name calling and inappropriate remarks, that might be enough for them to actually change their vote and vote for Harris. So wow. I do think the campaign needs to worry about this, regardless of how they spin it.
Well, that answers, I guess, part of my question, which is whether there's a strategy to this. Flooding the zone, having us talk about Donald Trump all day, whether it's garbage or rifles aimed at Liz Cheney or whatever the rhetoric that day might be. We're not talking about Kamala Harris or things that she is proposing. Jeanne, I wonder your thoughts on that, or is it in fact a danger when it comes to gathering new votes to sit down with Tucker Carlson on Halloween and let it rip?
I think it is incredible danger for the campaign. You know, Donald Trump has always been of the sort of Andy Warhol view that any publicity is good publicity. Get out there, keep talking. The reality is, whoever this election ends up being a referendum on is likely to lose. And at this point, to Rick's point, we don't hear much from Kamala Harris. I mean, she's out there, she's talking, but not in this incendiary language that is catching fire. It is all about Donald Trump, all about garbage, all about shooting people in the face, all about reminding us of the chaos that was his administration. And that is the death knell for the campaign. Think about it from another perspective. He could get out there today and say, look at those job numbers, 12,000. That is horrible. I will create 12 million jobs, or whatever number he wants to give, and focus on the economy. That's what people are upset about, and they're upset about Joe Biden. Instead, he does everything but talk about the issues that will move those undecided voters to his lane. A big problem. Yeah, Andy Warhol's theory works if you are, I don't know, a comedian or an actor. He is running for president of the United States.
Yeah, ask Hinchcliffe about that. We did hear from Liz Cheney, Rick, quote, "This is how dictators destroy free nations." She actually retweeted the video. "They threaten," she writes, "those who speak against them with death," unquote. Is that pushing it a little far? Or should that in fact be the response? She's effectively a surrogate for the Kamala Harris campaign here.
Yeah, I don't think you can really just judge it on one comment. I mean, the reality is there's a lot of reporting on a lot of Republicans who were threatened within his own administration, like General Milley, who was his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest ranking military officer in the country, who served at the pleasure of the President of the United States. And he's had to, basically fortify his home and hire lawyers and be prepared for an onslaught of retribution from Donald Trump. Now, this is not an isolated example. If it were, we'd have a conversation about it and probably wouldn't affect much. But the reality is, Donald Trump has flooded the zone, but he's flooded the zone with this kind of sort of, retribution tour again. And it's what held him back in the summer before the convention. And he seems to be reintroducing that into the campaign, going after people, settling scores. This is not what his own voters want to hear. His own voters want to hear, changing the administration and fixing the problems that were incumbent in the Biden administration.
It's pretty incredible to see the Harris campaign flood TikTok with the Access Hollywood tape all over again for young people who weren't there to witness it the first time around. You wonder what the cumulative effect will be. Didn't matter the first time. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, see you on the late edition of Balance of Power, 5 p.m. Eastern, right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
In New York, thanks for joining us on Balance of Power, the fastest show in politics here on Bloomberg TV and radio, as we prepare to spend some time with Julie Pace at the Associated Press, who will be overseeing the calling of races next week. When you hear us say the Associated Press has called this state or has called this Senate race, it's going to be Julie Pace and her team making that known. As we find the op-ed in the Associated Press today from Julie Pace, the headline for the U.S. election, the AP performs the world's single largest act of journalism. Consider, as she writes, the important work is being done against the backdrop of an electorate that has become increasingly skeptical of election results. An AP NORC poll from 2023 showed only 44% of Americans say they are highly confident the votes in this presidential election, 2024, will be counted accurately. Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist Rick Davis is with us, partner at Stone Court Capital, as we prepare to talk to Julie Pace. Rick, you've run campaigns. You know what it's like to be waiting to hear from the Associated Press. This has become a riskier journalistic endeavor compared to years past, isn't it?
Yeah, there's so much information available, and frankly, more and more skepticism on the part of voters. So, you want to get it right. I remember one night during the South Carolina primary in 2008, we lost the South Carolina primary in 2000. It ended the campaign, basically. So it was really important. I get a call. I'm with the McCains, and, it's AP saying, okay, 10 minutes, we're going to announce that you've won the South Carolina primary. Be ready. And of course, you've got one speech that says, concession, another victory. Yeah. Which one are you going to prep for, right? So we go into the bedroom. We're prepping for that victory speech. And I get a call back about 5 minutes later saying, hold off. We got to rerun the model. I mean, if something doesn't look right here. I'm like, what do you mean? You just said I won. Look, it's not a perfect science, but it has gotten so much better. And, they prepare months and months in advance with their models and their information that they have available that literally can predict an outcome based on early vote that's been incredibly accurate. And I think, voters can rely upon it.
Mm-hmm. That's, of course, not to be confused with broadcast networks, other news outlets. Everyone's got a website now. I used to call them newspapers, but they're not anymore, Rick. They're all going to make their own calls. They have their own decision desks, and they all work independently of the Associated Press, even though they're members of that consortium. Can you explain that to our listeners and viewers who are going to hear multiple calls from different places at different times?
That's right. Starting at about 6:30 East Coast time, data is flowing into these models. And you're right. Each network now has its own, quote, decision desk, right? And they like to make decisions on their own. They don't coordinate with others. They don't coordinate with the AP. And they have their own models. Every one of them has different polling data that will be instrumental in making a judgment call, and their own political instincts, right? In some cases, there's a gut check that's involved, and they have to delay an announcement unless they have really total confidence they know what the outcome's going to be. And so you could have competing outcomes. You could have competing calls where one network calls it for one candidate and another calls it for someone else, or withdraws the announcement that somebody has won, based like on what happened in 2000 with Florida. So the reality is there is a good chance of confusion, but I must say, as a campaign professional, we never acted upon anything that didn't come from the AP.
It's quite the setup for Julie Pace. Rick Davis, thank you, as always, for being with us on Balance of Power. She is executive editor of the Associated Press and joins us from Washington with a massive responsibility ahead next week. Julie, it's great to have you, and I appreciate your time. As you're right, the AP performs the world's single largest act of journalism. And I was looking at your website a little while ago. You talk about your decision team here, driven entirely by facts. Calls made by other organizations, as we were just discussing with Rick, who I know you've worked with, have no bearing on when the Associated Press declares a candidate the winner. I would love for you to walk us through this. This is an opportunity to go to school with Julie Pace for our listeners and viewers. How big is your decision team, and what is the methodology that goes into calling a race?
Sure. Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. Really one of our primary focuses in the lead up to the election, and then certainly as we're calling races, is going to be transparency, making sure that people really understand all of the effort, the work, the preparation that goes into these race calls, and then making sure that we're being transparent about how we make the calls when they come through. I think the biggest thing that I would emphasize is, we've been doing this at the AP for more than 175 years. And this is a full-time operation for us. This isn't just something that we stand up in an election year. So our teams are really spending, their full time understanding rule changes in states, methodology of voting in states, the rhythm of the counting and the vote tabulations in these states. And at the core of our effort is 4,000 vote count reporters who are going to be all across the country physically in counties, which is where elections in the United States are administered. And they are really our ultimate system of checks and balances, making sure that they are matching up the vote count numbers with the numbers that counties may be putting and states may be putting in their databases. And that's really where this whole operation starts. That data is fed up through the models and into our race analysts and ultimately our decision desk. They have an exceptional accuracy rate, and we're really confident that we're going to be able to deliver on that accuracy, but also be able to transparently explain to the public what we're doing come Tuesday and beyond.
Fascinating. How much human involvement is involved in the moment of making the call versus having criteria in advance that a computer could tell you when you reach that point, when certain votes are cast in certain areas of a district, for instance? Are you in a room with your team looking at each other in the eye saying, are we going for this or not?
Yeah, ultimately, the final decision makers on race calls are human journalists at the Associated Press. Our team is the one, humans are the one that make those final decisions. But obviously we're aided by statistical analysis and modeling and the actual raw data that's coming in. The closer the race is in a particular state, the more you need actual vote count. The more the model is one of the tools in your toolkit, but you're really just looking at the actual vote, the raw vote count that's coming in here. But this is always going to be a situation where we've got a human who's an expert in their state or in their race, potentially, depending on the way, that we've divided things up that year. And they're the ones that are really helping us make that final call.
How local do you need to get in congressional districts in certain states? You talked about the long history of the Associated Press here. That allows you to understand the nuances of each area that you're calling a race in. How different are they all?
Yeah, so we are down to the county level because, again, I think one of the interesting and unique things about the American system of elections is that there is no federal elections office. There is no federal agency that administers elections, so you don't have a one-size-fits-all approach. And as a result, you actually have elections that are run within states in multiple different ways. And so that's why that team of 4,000 vote count reporters is absolutely essential, because they need to be focused on what's happening in the county that they're in. That's the only thing that they're focused on in that moment, is the way that the election is administered down at that local level. Yep. And we need that level of nuance because of the complexity of these elections.
Coming off of what we saw in 2020 and the expectation for contested races, certainly on the presidential level this year, is there a lawyer involved in making these calls? Do you look at lawsuits, potential recounts in a district before you call it?
So there's no lawyer involved in our act of actually calling the races, but we look at a range of factors when we're making the decision to call a race. And one of the things that we look at is there an automatic recount in a state? Some states have a tiny margin where if the race is within that margin, then it goes to an automatic recount. We want to make sure that the AP race call is not brought up as part of a legitimate legal process. We want to make sure that our race call can stand and withstand, any other external factors. So certainly those are factors that we look at, but really ultimately this comes down to a simple question, which is, does the trailing candidate have a way to catch up? And if the answer to that is no, then we decide that we're ready to move forward with that race call.
That's fascinating. What about reports, as we've seen recently, of ballot boxes being set on fire, ballots being destroyed? If you have cases like that, if there's damage to ballots, if you have protests around a precinct, do you have to put things on hold? Or does that not impact your model because you're looking at a different sample of the electorate?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I would say that every one of those potential situations is unique and different. And so it's hard to give a one-size-fits-all answer to that. What we're always looking at in a situation like that is, how many ballots are we talking about? Are we talking about 10 ballots? Are we talking about 1,000 ballots? Are we talking about 10,000 ballots? Historically, elections in the United States are, while quite complex, exceptionally well run. And the incidence of true voter fraud or moments where large numbers of votes that cannot be counted for some reason in numbers that could actually sway the outcome of the election, that just doesn't exist. We looked back at 2020 to find the number of incidents of true voter fraud, and it was a couple of hundred incidents, and that was a race that was obviously decided by far more. So we watch these things, but really this does come down to the size and the number of votes that we could potentially be talking about.
As I read on the How We Call Races page, I would encourage everybody, go to ap.org to read this. Who calls them? When does the AP call a race? Where can I find AP race calls? There's a lot of interesting information here, but you point out that a lot of races are won on election night, but not uncommon for it to take a few days, maybe even weeks, to reach that point. Julie, everybody's got an office pool going on when the presidential race is going to be called, and we only have the last election really to base this on. It took us until Saturday. What's the Associated Press prepared for?
Look, we're prepared for any scenario here. It's impossible to predict when we'll call the race for the presidency. I would say that at the presidential level, 2020 was an anomaly. If you look back from sort of 2004, through 2020, most of those presidential races have been called either on Tuesday night, on election night, or early on Wednesday. Sometimes House races, Senate races can go on much longer, but we're prepared for any scenario. If there is a longer wait for a call, our real focus is going to be on being transparent, explaining why that's the case, and making sure that the public is informed about everything that we're looking at, so they know, what's accurate information that's out there about the race call and the process of getting to a winner.
We just want to know when we're going to see our families again, Julie. If you have any reporting on that, that would be
I wish
valuable.
I knew when I was going to see my family again, too. So if anybody has any information, let me know.
I bet that's true. We've only got a minute or so left. Does this job that you call the most important act in journalism, come with an enormous amount of added stress after what we experienced 4 years ago?
Look, it's certainly not something that's easy. And, we often say to ourselves here, if it was easy, everybody would do this. We've been doing this for 175 years because we think it's an enormous public service. And that's what the Associated Press is about. We're about public service journalism. And without that federal elections agency, it was really into that void that the AP, really at the founding of our organization, really stepped in. And we've been doing this, carrying this mission out ever since. And I hope, what the public understands is that that same AP that has been calling these races all these years, that people have relied on and trusted and believed in, it's the same organization making those calls this time around. And I hope that that long history and that long record of accuracy, will matter when people are making their decisions about what information to trust.
We actually got to put a face on it here. Remember Julie Pace when you hear these calls being made next week, a world-class journalist and executive editor at the Associated Press. Julie, thank you so much for the seminar on how the AP calls races. The decision team, by the way, will declare at least 6,823 winners, federal, state, and local races next week, with special coverage here on Tuesday on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.